have an assessment to align assessment, a valid assessment, it means really developing a framework, having a framework that allows you to map what you're trying to achieve in those competencies, and then what are the valid ways of assessing those, both in a formative way, in other words, in the classroom, as children are progressing throughout the year, grade by grade, but then also the more summative assessments, and of course, leading to large-scale assessments. So it's important to acknowledge that not everything that's in the curriculum needs to be assessed in the same way. And it's also important to understand that if you're talking about tests, examinations, they can only test certain things. They can only give evidence about learning of certain things. So when we talk about assessment, what we're talking about are the options that you have, the valid options. If you're if you're assessing some skills, it's important to work out whether that's best done through a test or whether it's best done through a project or a performance. And of course, the other element that's really important here is, what are your priorities? What are the important things that you want information about in terms of across the country? So being really clear about what it is as your priorities that you want to know about as far as students' learning, knowledge, the skills, and maybe the values and attitudes, and then what is the valid assessment tool that you need for that. Well, it's very important when looking at both curriculum and assessment to understand that the approach to assessment has to be valid, and it has to be aligned to the curriculum. Too many countries have experienced the opposite, where they're putting in place assessments, and those might be tests, where they're actually testing items that aren't actually in the curriculum. And what can happen as a result of that over time, the teachers then start to actually teach what's going to be in the test rather than what's in the curriculum. That's why you've got to get that alignment really, it has to be reflected in the assessment of what's actually in the curriculum. So it really means at the school level for the classroom teacher, right through to those that are setting the big, large-scale assessments, they have to know the curriculum well, identify what are the priorities to be assessed at points in time in a student's journey through their basic education, and then identify from that what would be the major items that you'd want to assess and how best to assess those, whether it means short responses, whether it means extended responses, whether it means developing a project that a student has to show a range of skills that they've brought together and produce something, whether it's a performance, as you might see in a music performance, whether it's actually in terms of literacy and numeracy, what are the fundamental skills that you want to be able to assess and then monitor over time. So there's a lot of things to consider, and that's why an assessment framework is really important. What are the major areas that you want as priorities to assess? When are we going to best identify the point in time of a child's journey in their learning to assess that? You may even want to consider whether you have whole population assessments. That means that every child in grade 4 or every child in grade 6 or every child in grade 9 to assess their performance in a range of subject areas. Or you might also want to mix that with some sampling as well. So not have every student, but you sample so that you get, it's a way of monitoring how well the curriculum's being implemented, but not necessarily getting information at the individual student level. So there's a lot to decide there in the framework. Well, it's very important. Assessment really tells you not only how well a subject area is being implemented, but it's also an indicator of how individual students are performing. It enables you to identify gaps in learning of particular groups. It allows you to look at equity issues as to which students are achieving. It might be related to gender. Are girls performing better in some subject areas than boys, and the reverse? It may be that students in high socioeconomic areas are performing well compared to those in low socioeconomic areas. It could be that rural students are not performing as well as those in urban settings. And you can really get a whole lot of data from these assessments to work out where are the equity gaps, and then identify how you're going to address those. Assessment really is the way of demonstrating to yourself whether the curriculum is being well implemented, what aspects of it are not being implemented as well, and that then can lead to better training of teachers, better professional learning for them. There can be resource decisions, and really it comes down to using the assessment to acquire as much data as you can to help you make some big decisions, not solely about the curriculum being implemented, but who's gaining from that and who is not in terms of the students. One of the pitfalls is that's the only thing that you assess, the things that can be assessed through an exam. You have attitudes and values in your curriculum. So how might you judge how well the students are achieving in those terms? That's another form of assessment, and often it comes from observation. It's also in terms of skills. How are students bringing all that they develop together to be able to use the skills that they're acquiring in different contexts? Now, in an examination, you can only test certain skills. Often they're procedural skills. But if you really wanted to find out if a student can perform, using a range of different skills, critical thinking, for example, communication, and various forms of communication, then a large-scale assessment that's an exam won't do that for you. So maybe you need to think of other, which can be large-scale assessments, but they're not necessarily an examination. So in other words, it's to do with performance. It's to do with observations that are done, independent observations. There's an added element here, though. There are implications from this. It is cheaper to run exams than it is to do other forms of assessment. And that's one of the reasons why we have a tendency to use exams more across the world than other forms of assessment. But we need to know that exams can only assess a slice of the curriculum and what a child has achieved. When you look at the richness of what you've developed in your curriculum, there are skills and knowledge and competencies that an exam can't be used to assess that. So it's important not to see the exam as the only way students can demonstrate their achievement. What we've found in an interesting way, unplanned through COVID-19, is that many countries that have large-scale assessments have had to look for alternative methods. They've had to look at how teachers make judgments. And by and large, experienced teachers with good support and good training actually can make very good judgments about achievement of students. And if they're moderated well, really there are alternatives to using exams, although in most countries now they would have a blend of large-scale examinations and some other forms of assessment. There are several factors that have led to examinations being seen as a major strategy, if not the only strategy used by some countries as a way of checking whether students have acquired the knowledge and skills that you would want them to. Part of this is to do with history, and it goes back to in the centuries, the way of determining achievement was to do the test, to sit the test, and in some cultures, that's strongly embedded in their culture is doing the test. As we've grown our understanding and developed our appreciation for all the things we want young people to be able to do, we have realised that exams are really only one contributing way and tool, a strategy to get information about a student. So, there are observation charts that you can develop. There are projects that you can initiate where a student has to demonstrate that they've gone through a process and they've applied a whole lot of skills to solve, an important project, for example. There are performances that students do. And when we look at all the skills and knowledge that we want young people to acquire, it becomes very clear that an examination is not going to be able to give you the information about that. Why haven't there hasn't been a significant investment in alternatives to tests? Well, two reasons really. One is other forms can be costly. There are ways you can minimize the cost, but when students have to do projects and then somebody has to assess that, that has to be transported somewhere, or the person who's judging it has to be transported. And also, there's a sense that of independence. You can't, there's a view you can't rely on, you can't trust the teacher to make an appropriate judgment and score. We have found that when that's been required, with the right measures in place, with the right ways of monitoring assessments, you can overcome that. And certainly various countries have had to do that during COVID-19. The other matter is really that there are a lot of experts in setting exams. It's become an industry, if you like. And so there are a lot of people who have expertise in that. There are less people that have expertise in setting alternative types of assessments. But as a subject by subject area, increasingly within those subject areas, there are experts that are developing the alternative assessments because they've wanted to match that to the curriculum. Certainly lessons learnt from Australia's experience and other countries, and that is that when you are designing the large-scale assessments, you need to be very clear about what the purpose is, and also clear that this gives you a really important opportunity to gauge how your young people are developing, and yet at the same time, media, governments and politicians, it can end up being skewed in various ways from the original purpose. So the important thing is to be very clear from the beginning why you want to have this large-scale exam, what you want to acquire from it, what you're going to do as a result of that data, and then being prepared to monitor how you're going with that, and to involve the stakeholders. Very important across the world, really. The best way is to involve the stakeholders. That means the teachers, parents, academics, and the media, and to be able to be very clear in what you're trying to achieve, get their support and backing in what you're trying to do. And I think you've got to stay the course. You can easily end up using the exams in other ways. A good example, when you start to get results, and if you reach a point, which some countries have, we experienced it here in Australia for a while, where schools become ranked on their performance, and you give a lot of emphasis to achievement of a school or a state. What that can do is it can lead to a whole lot of practices that are really aimed at achieving good results in the exam rather than improving teaching learning. So good thing to think about is how do you want to monitor the performance of students, but also the growth of students? What is the difference a school is making as we look in the trends? So try not to focus too much on the single result, but what's the trend over time, and what steps are being taken, and what resources are being applied to support improvement for all students across the country.